Let's give one more minute.
Hey, Misty.
Hey, is that your office?
I'm walking my dogs.
Yay.
Hey, Donna.
Hey, Nancy, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to hear your voice.
It's good to hear you. I'm looking forward to your talk. Have you
What
been?
kind of dogs do you have?
I have 2 standard poodles.
Oh, that's a good breed.
Yeah, I'll show you. Be
Yeah, let's
gratuitous.
see.
Yeah, I have to like turn my camera on. And then there's Kato.
Oh,
And
very
there's Truman.
nice.
And here I am in the beautiful sunshine.
The beautiful sunshine of Kansas.
I'm glad you can zoom outdoors. That's really cool.
Yeah, I do this sometimes. I'll join on the computer here in a few minutes when I get back to my house.
All right. So I think Nancy will go ahead and get started here, and I'm sure there'll be some more folks who will trickle on. So welcome to the last session of the fall virtual seminar series for the Kansas Population Center. So excited to have everyone join us. We are so incredibly lucky that today our seminar presenter is Nancy Folbre. She is the director of the program on gender and care work in the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, professor emerita of economics and senior fellow of the Levy Economics Institute at Baird College. Nancy is an icon and just such a model and I just get googly eyes just thinking about Nancy and all of her work and how it has inspired so much of my own work. And so, you know, I'm sure, Nancy, you don't need much more of an introduction other than just to say that Nancy has some really critical, fascinating books that she has written throughout her career on understanding the economics of family, the care economy, unpaid care. And I encourage everybody to just take a look at her material. And, with that, Nancy, I think I'll turn it over to you so that you can enlighten us with your current research activities.
Well, thank you so much, Missy. It's really great to be here, and I hope I can live up to your very sweet introduction. So I think we have an hour, right? So I'm gonna try and stay at 30 minutes so that we have plenty of time to talk. And here's my PowerPoint. I hope everybody can see it. All systems okay so far?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, so this is a paper that is been accepted for publication, but hasn't quite been finalized. So happy to get comments or criticisms, but not much scope for major revisions. And the theme, as you can see from the title, is parental expenditures of time and money on children in the U.S. And my co-author, Leela Gautam, did a lot of the heavy lifting on this paper and has been a really great collaborator. So I'm sorry she can't be here today. Here's what I'm going to cover. First of all, why these expenditures on children matter. Second, how expenditures on children are estimated. Third, how to value parental time devoted to children using the panel study of income dynamics data. I think an interesting sidebar is substitutability between time and expenditures, which this data set allows us to examine. And then I'm going to close with some implications. So the biggest part of the big why is that care provision is really key to the overall economy. But it's also true that many countries have, including the US, have expressed a lot of concern about below replacement fertility rates. And these are clearly affected by the perceived cost of children, the relative size of parental expenditures. And also there are a lot of public policies on the table, like family allowances and baby bonuses. And, you know, thinking about their effects depends a lot on how large they are relative to the size of private expenditures. They often look pretty big in the abstract, but when you compare them to what actual private costs are, they look a lot more, generally look a lot more modest. Okay, let's go a little. There we go. Oh, I see. I'm not out of practice with this moving forward. Okay, sorry. Then another reason why this is really important is that mothers pay a disproportionate share of the cost. They devote more time to children than fathers do, and also they're just much more likely than fathers to end up being single parents and bearing a lot of the financial burdens. And there's a lot of research on the motherhood penalty on women's earnings, but there's been less research on their impact on family income. So that's why I think that refining estimates of the cost of children is important. So you may or may not know that it's the US Department of Agriculture that takes responsibility for estimating parental expenditures on a pretty regular basis every 4 or 5 years. And they do this based on data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. I've always found it hilarious that it's the USDA that's in charge of this task. It's as though they're thinking of children as a really important crop. Here's the cover of their latest survey expenditures on survey report, expenditures on children by families in 2015. And what they came up with is an estimate for parental money expenditures on the youngest child in a 2-child married couple, middle income family through age 17 in 2015 dollars, $233,610, which is a pretty big piece of change. And they make these calculations, you know, in a very stylized way, kind of, you know, putting parents into bins: 2-parent, 1-parent, low income, middle income, and there are a lot of details about the way they do it that I don't think you need to worry too much about here. You know, basically we're replicating their approach in adding on time expenditures, the value of time, because that seems like the sort of best strategy for getting policymakers to pay attention to the estimates. So just to be clear, what the USD estimates don't include or any of the costs of pregnancy or childbirth, or any of the costs of college or any post-secondary training, or any other transfers to children over 18, or the cost of foregone earnings or leisure. So it starts out as a measure of cash expenditures that's almost certainly on the low side, and it's important to keep that in mind. So it's not easy to figure out how to put together information on time use and expenditures, because the surveys were designed in such a way, they're so specialized, they're so compartmentalized, they're so, you know, siloed, that you can't really crosswalk them except through statistical matching. And I'll talk about the statistical matching option a little bit at the end of the talk. The Consumer Expenditure Survey has no information on time use. The American Time Use Survey has no information on expenditures. And the panel study of income dynamics only started pretty recently to collect information on childcare. For many years, it collected information on housework, but not on childcare time. But in 2017 and 2019, it began to do that. So this provided a pretty great opportunity. So one thing to be aware of is that the panel study of income dynamics collects information for 2-parent and single-parent families. Each adult in the household is surveyed, so you can actually get a measure of total household expenditures and household childcare time. And so we excluded all families that didn't fit this description, because we needed to have information about household totals. And the individuals in the PSID were asked, how much time did you devote to childcare and also to housework in a typical week? And this is what is known as a stylized survey question. And time use experts, time use researchers have long been somewhat skeptical of answers to these stylized questions on the grounds that they are probably subject to recall bias and social desirability bias and more approximate than the results that are yielded by a time diary of the sort that the American Time Use Survey administers. But there's another kind of side to the argument, which is that the ATUS focuses primarily on very specific activities in childcare. Like you have to be doing something like feeding a child or bathing a child or dressing a child. And the ATUS does collect a measure of supervisory responsibility. It's the answer to a question, while you were engaged in this activity, was a child under the age of 13 in your care? But people have not really paid a lot of attention to the answers to this particular question. And I've done a lot of empirical work with the ATUS, really trying to explain and show why it's actually a pretty accurate and plausible measure of constraints on parental time. And the very interesting thing about the PSID estimates, the stylized questions, is that they come very, very close to estimates for the same year from the ATUS if you add together supervisory time measured by that in your care question and active childcare time. And that was a finding by some folks at the Michigan Population Center that was kind of our inspiration for doing this analysis. If that had not been the case, I think we would have been hesitant to devote very much time to the stylized questions. But we, as a result of this comparison, feel pretty confident of their accuracy. They are more accurate for women than for men. And that is a possible issue that we might want to return to. So the basic strategy for coming up with our estimates is first to start out by replicating the USD estimates of expenditures on children and making sure that we were doing it the same way, which we were able to do with the 2015 data. And there are some details about what the USDA does and what assumptions it makes that we can explore in the discussion if you're interested in it. But again, we're using it as a benchmark because it's basically the only kind of consistent and reliable source of estimates based on the CEX that we know of. So our next step is to estimate time devoted to children from the PSID, and then looking at childcare time, total childcare time divided by number of children, and total housework divided by the total number of household members. And then we take those hours estimates and multiply them by a almost laughably lower bound estimate of dollar value. We take the replacement cost valuation based on state level minimum wages. And we choose that basically because there's so much resistance to assigning a value to unpaid childcare that we feel like it's better to start the discussion with a very conservative estimate than not. And the replacement cost method is the one that's basically used for aggregate measures of childcare time that are consistent with the national income accounts. And this is the methodology that's used in the satellite national income accounts that do include an imputation for the value of unpaid work. So then we add those two things together. So it's a pretty, in terms of empirical exercise, it's pretty basic. So here's the I think most interesting summary of the results of the averages. Is it you can see the clear white bars are money expenditures. The dark gray bars are the value of unpaid work, and the light gray bars are the total. And so you can see for ages, when the age of the youngest child is from 0 to 2, and that's the expenditures that we're looking at. It's the unpaid value of the unpaid work is more than twice the value of the monetary expenditures, and the total is commensurately higher than it is for any other group. And so, one takeaway from this graph is obviously the height of the dark gray bars relative to the white bars. And you see that height declines with the age of the youngest child. So I think this is interesting, that there's much more variation in the amount of time, total parental time devoted per child than there is in the expenditures per child. And the expenditures go up slightly as children get older, but not that much compared to the pretty dramatic decline in unpaid and the value of unpaid care. And then a second really interesting empirical finding is that looking at the value of time reveals pretty large disparities between single and 2 adult parents. So if you look at the first panel on the left with the child aged 6 to 8, what you see is that the expenditures per child are actually smaller in a 2 adult family than in a single parent family, but the value of time devoted to kids is much larger. And that's also true for older children. I find it very surprising that there isn't a bigger difference in expenditures per child and expenditures, but it's also really interesting that the big advantage, economic advantage in a 2 adult household is coming more from the additional time that's available to children, devoted to children, than from the actual expenditures, cash expenditures. So another really interesting empirical result is that since we have data on expenditures and also on the amount of time in weekly hours, we can look at how expenditures and time trade off or don't trade off with each other. And what these graphs show is, I think, a pretty surprising finding, although one that's consistent with other time use research, which is that the time devoted to housework is pretty constant across a wide variety of expenditures. So, if in fact, it has a slightly positive slope. And that may be because people that are spending more money have bigger homes or bigger families or higher standards for unpaid work. But for whatever reason, they're not able to really, or they don't seem to be either able or willing to buy their way out of much housework. But for childcare, it's a very different story. If they're not spending much money on childcare, they're spending many more hours in weekly hours of unpaid care, and the slope of the line is pretty negative there. So that's the kind of substitutability that I think we would have expected to see overall with unpaid work. So estimates that lump childcare and housework together are likely to find a negative relationship, but what that's really showing is kind of the negative slope of the childcare hours trade-off, countervailing the much less strong relationship between hours and expenditures. So here are some caveats behind these estimates. The consistency between the PSID and the ATUS that I mentioned earlier is very strong for women, but if anything, men's unpaid work is underestimated in the PSID. So it's not a perfect match, and that's something to be aware of. So I don't think that really threatens the conclusions we draw from our estimates, because probably fathers are doing more unpaid work than is showing up in the PSID. Of course, issues of valuation are always kind of arbitrary and crude. We also calculated opportunity costs based on estimated wage rates, but we think those estimates they're more relevant for individuals thinking about what is their best time allocation than they are for a kind of national accounting framework, which is, based on a kind of different counterfactual. What would it, if parents withdrew their time, what would it cost to replace it? Is kind of the counterfactual behind a replacement cost approach. There's no measure here of childcare quality, so we don't know how that is varying between households with different expenditures, but a lot of research suggests that higher income, better educated households devote more time to developmental care, so that's a factor that would, if anything, accentuate the finding that the big advantage for two-parent families lies in more time rather than more money. There's no consideration here of economies of scale. I've done a lot of head scratching about equivalent scales and what kinds of equivalent scales we might want to use for comparisons like these. And pretty much the best we can do is guess at what a better set of parameters would be than the conventional parameters. I'm happy to talk about this further if this is something you're interested in discussing. But for the purpose of this analysis and following the lead of the USDA, which also basically ignores this issue, we kind of set it aside. And then another shortcoming here is that we can't really measure non-parental care or utilization of subsidized childcare that people are not paying money for. So it could be that those results between single parent and two-parent families are very inaccurate, because a lot of single parent families are taking advantage of grandparents or other relatives to help out. So that's boosting their kind of time budget. And likewise, utilization of subsidized childcare is not going to show up in the expenditure column. But anyway, nonetheless, as we say, we think these estimates are more accurate than the USD estimates that are based on monetary expenditures alone. Seems important that they reveal differences by age of child. Seems important that they show bigger differences in expenditures, total expenditures between single and two-parent families. And they certainly indicate that childcare services reduce the temporal cost of children. And they probably do that primarily by reducing supervisory time. There's a lot of evidence that high hours of maternal employment reduce active childcare a lot less than they reduce supervisory care. And a lot of what out-of-home childcare services are doing is relieving the constraint on at least one parent to stay home with the child, even when it's taking a nap or watching TV or playing in the backyard. So I think it just helps fill out the picture, flesh out the picture of childcare. And if you think about the policy implications, they're really pretty significant because child support obligations of non-custodial parents are set by states. There's a lot of variation in how they're specified and how they're enforced, and none of them really take into account the value of the time that custodial parents are devoting to children. That's not something that is considered compensable. Likewise, foster care reimbursement rates are based on the cost of feeding and clothing a child, and they don't take into account the cost of the time devoted to children. Needless to say, the foster care system has a very difficult time recruiting good foster care parents. So I think that looking at the value of parental time helps drive that point home. I think it means we're, we haven't really fully captured the economic disadvantage of single parent households because we haven't looked at differences in total time outputs. And more broadly, I think that looking at the value of childcare time just helps direct attention away from the market economy towards aspects of the non-market economy that are really relevant to producing and developing and maintaining human capabilities, which I think is kind of the key contribution of the care sector. So apparently children are really not our most important crop. We don't really have the data that we need to do a better job putting together estimates of the value of cash expenditures and time expenditures. But one project that I mentioned at the outset that I hope will be coming public in the near future is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has supported a project to statistically match data from the American Time Use Survey, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and the Survey of Income and Program Participation to arrive at more complete measures of household consumption. And I participated to some extent as a consultant on this project. I think it's really fascinating. And I think it's going to give us some really good averages and descriptive statistics. But because the data is statistically matched, it doesn't give you a lot of kind of leeway to look at the statistical relationships between the statistically matched records. So I think even though it's a really important contribution, I really think we need more coordinated data collection in order to measure total private expenditures on children and also to bring public expenditures on children into the picture. So there you go. Thanks for your attention. Really eager to hear whatever comments or questions you have.
That's great, Nancy. Thank you so much. I have questions, but maybe before I dive into questions that I have, we'll see if anybody in the audience has lingering questions that they have for Nancy about this.
This kind of reminds me that Susan Meyer's research that money doesn't matter. So it seems consistent with the parental time investment and the two-parent advantage is the parent time of the parents. Would that be your understanding of the results?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, her book is What Money Can't Buy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think that well, and the other thing that's interesting is just how the time that working parents spend with their children is different than the time that single parents or stay-at-home moms spend with their kids. That time is very different as well. So the working moms invest more in quality of interaction as opposed to quantity. So
well, let me say, Melissa Milkey has a new paper out in Time and Society in which she kind of challenges that assumption that we should always value developmental care more than being present. Mm-hmm. And her argument is that just being present with kids may be something that we've underestimated, that it's not as quote unquote educational, but it's more like role model. It's more like socialization. It's more like building a stronger relationship, being available, so forth and so on. So I think her paper, it's a very interesting challenge to that notion that making the baby listen to Mozart is really what you need to do.
Okay.
It's also reminded me of, you know, like if I think back to just my own childhood, you know, which would have been like in the 80s. And, you know, parents were much more like loosey-goosey, and, you know, they would just kick you out of the house and shut the door, and you were expected to play outside all day, but there wasn't a lot of kind of direct interaction between parent and child per se. But, you know, it goes along with this argument of having the parent there, you know, in the instance where the child might need some self-correction or you know, some kind of guide rails. I think there's probably a lot to be said in terms of value of that.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot we don't know. We don't yet
Yeah.
know really about issues of quality, and we have to keep after them.
I had a couple of questions about some of the graphs that you put up. So you know, you had the graph where it was like, so first of all, my question is, if we were to like accumulate the total value of raising a child in today's society that isn't just monetary based on kind of consumption and expenditures, essentially, I mean, you didn't put up like the big number in your slides that I was kind of waiting for at the end, but if I'm calculating right according to the cost by age, you know, and the amount that it goes up, basically it's increasing from like 233K to like, I don't know, somewhere between 500 and 600
Well,
thousand, like that.
Keep in mind it's different years. The BLS, I mean the USDA estimates are for 2015, and ours are for 2017 and 19. So that's one factor. And then also keep in mind it's for one child, and a lot of people are you know, the total cost for most parents is twice that, or 2.5, you know, 2.1 times that, right? And I guess I'm a little bit, I think the totals are a dramatic thing, like, oh my God, look at how much you've spent on kids. And I think that in a way I was trying to get away from that, you know, the horror story, like, oh my God, if you'd put this in your investment retirement account, think how much better off you'd be, you know. And also there's no discounting in that picture. So you know, but I agree the totals are important. Yeah.
And so one question I had about the graph that was like by age groups, it was, you know, expenditures were really like flat, like what you basically showed is expenditures were flat, but then like the time, if we cost out the value of the time, you know, it's higher when they're infants and it goes down. And I was wondering about the expenditures, because it seems to me like the kids below school age, you know, one would expend on daycare services, which the cost of daycare seems to reduce. It doesn't totally go away when kids start school, but it definitely goes down. So I don't know if
but older kids, but you know, the cost of childcare goes down, but the cost of clothes and food and
other
iPads.
items. Phones these days.
Oh yeah, I should have said phones. Yeah, phone. But it's still mysterious. I'd like to have a more detailed analysis of expenditures on children than the CEX provides, because I find that a very surprising result.
So Nancy, have you thought about doing this in other countries?
It would be really hard, I think, because, well, first of all, we had the USDA precedent to build on, right? But consumer expenditure data is very, I would describe it as somewhat idiosyncratic. And the Consumer Expenditure Survey is kind of a bear to use empirically. And so the thought of looking at consumer expenditure survey from other countries is kind of terrifying, but it would be an interesting exercise.
Right. So the reason I asked this is I was in Korea, which has a total fertility rate of 0.7. I mean, it's a nation that's committing suicide. essentially. And so being able to kind of affect these, estimate these costs of children. I mean, is it price or is it culture that's driving the fertility rate so low in Japan and Korea?
I think it's clearly both.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think it's kind of a bargaining problem. As you know, I'm a big fan of thinking about what goes on in households in bargaining terms.
Right.
And I think when women have a hard time combining paid work and family work, they often see the optimal strategy is to not get married or to not have kids. And that's kind of what, I mean, I think maybe that's what you would call a cultural explanation, that there's a lot more resistance. I mean, Korea has these incredibly long work days and work weeks that basically make it impossible for men to really participate in a very meaningful way in family life. And then Korea also has this incredibly competitive educational system in which I mean, it really is like Squid Game. I mean, it's like the movie. It's like a movie in which the cost of losing is really, really high. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on on parents when they have kids. They have to kind of devote enormous resources to schooling and to tutoring and long hours of active developmental care to get their children into a decent position. And I think that maybe it's a sort of a combination of norms and costs, right?
Yeah.
But I think the Korean example is really interesting, and it is quite extreme.
It is. It's extremely, I pointed to when I was there, I pointed out work hours, right? And then, they have paid family leave, but if you leave your job and come back, you start over, right? You don't get your job back. I mean, it's just the incentives are just crazy.
It's just a very rigid, it's just very locked in.
Yeah.
Have you considered health costs at all? I mean, I think when I think about time use, it's like when you increase either the supervisory role or the engaged role, where are you taking that out of? And on one hand, it's possibly the paid workforce, but for a lot of moms, I think it's sleep, and kind of thinking about what are the implications of that, or it's exercise time or something else. Is there a way to consider those additional health costs?
Yeah.
I mean, in the case of Korea as well, Donna, I'm thinking, where are people taking from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we do know from the American Time Use Survey that mothers of young children in particular have a pretty significant sleep deficit, as do fathers of young children, although it's not as big. And also reduced leisure time, and some of it comes out of leisure time, I think. But most of I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of scope for thinking about, what active childcare, what responsibilities from active childcare subtract. But a lot of the work that time use researchers like Suzanne Bianchi did kind of showed that they're pretty flexibly adapted to kind of moving around the hours of the day and the weekend. So, working parents generally spend a lot of time with their children after they get home from work, and they have much more of a bedtime ritual of active engagement, with their children. They're sort of like, they compensate for that for not being there from 9 to 5 by a lot of participation from 5 to 8, and likewise on the weekends. And I think the interesting thing to me is that active care can be moved around. Like if you want to spend time reading to your child and that's a priority for you, you can do that between 7 and 8 at night instead of between 11 and 12, right? The day, right? So that's why I really think this issue of supervisory care is important, because it's just such a big constraint on parents to not be able to leave a child under the age of 13 unsupervised at home. And you can't, you can't move that around unless you have a neighbor or a friend or a family member or paid childcare to do it. And so I don't know, I'm sort of bending your question in my own self-interest to explain why I think the supervisory care issue is so important, because what it shows you, I think, is that if childcare were more affordable and more available for parents, it probably wouldn't reduce their active childcare very much, but it would really reduce the supervisory constraints. So it would actually probably enhance the overall quality of the childcare that parents are providing, because we've seen evidence of substitution away from quantity towards quality, and childcare promotes that.
So Nancy, I have, it's not, maybe it's a follow-on question, maybe not, but I'm just thinking about, like, if you look at the long-term trends for women, there's been like major increases in educational attainment over the decades. And I was just thinking about how that fits into some of the assumptions made in your work here around like using minimum wage. And so, and I get the whole, like, this is a conservative estimate and we, people have disagreements, but, to the extent that, is it possible to subset these caregivers based on like educational attainment and then assign different hourly values,
Yeah.
And what would that look like? Like, that just seems to, and especially if you think about doing that over a long period of time, it seems like, the cost of caring for kids is just, and which we know from an economics perspective, right? But
yeah, I think it's actually a really interesting conundrum, because the opportunity cost is much more relevant to your own effort to optimize as a parent. Like, what is this actually going to cost me? The opportunity cost is much more relevant, right?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's not as though your work as a mother is closely related to the value of what you earn in the marketplace. And just because you earn $1,000 an hour doesn't mean that your time devoted to a child is worth $1,000 an hour. And so it's more realistic on the individual level, but it kind of, it applies a market metric to what is basically a non-market contribution. Yeah. And that to me outweighs it on the aggregate level. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, sometimes people in the time use literature, you'll often say, oh, one way of estimating the value is to use replacement cost, and another way is opportunity cost. And I think that's wrong. I think they measure different things. And we should say, here's a replacement cost. It's relevant for these matters. Here's an opportunity cost, and it's relevant for other considerations. And so if I had more time, I would be looking at opportunity costs as well as replacement costs. If you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I have one last question, and then we'll open it up again for others who have questions. But can you tell us, just from like, so I guess it's maybe like two mini questions, but the first one is, it seems to me, and there's just a piece out in Vox, I think, or something, that there was just a like media piece out about how millennials are choosing not to have kids because they hear from the women above them like how crappy it is to try to raise children in the society we currently live in, and how all of that burden really falls disproportionately on women, and so millennial women are choosing not to have kids. So you have that argument, and then my question for you is like a policy piece, like what I have this thought in my head that like we are going to get to a certain point where women are just going to stop having children because the opportunity cost, if you will, is like just too much. And that is the point at which, you know, policy systems will really start to shift in and move towards supporting more family policy structures. So the idea is like, you know, we can't get Congress to like really take seriously family policy and fund it at an appropriate level because it's good for women or because it's good for children. But if the politicians believe that like their fate of their existence will deteriorate and humanity will die, like if it's about them and like that they're going to disappear, then finally they'll be willing to like, you know, put up some supports. And so my question is like, what do you think about that? And then the mini question around that is like, what do we, from a policy perspective, like what types of, how do we need to bolster the current data collection system so that we can accurately represent these things? And you did kind of touch on it in your talk, but I was just wondering if you had any follow-up to that.
I think the main kind of data priority should be to consolidate and streamline some existing surveys instead of having one survey that looks at time, another that looks at expenditures, another that looks at income and work hours, and then another that looks at participation in government programs. You know, survey administration is changing, the digital tools are transforming it. It seems to me that this is a really opportune moment to move towards a different way of thinking about surveys, and also to take some of the savings from a consolidated survey and use it to actually pay respondents for their time, because it's effing unpaid work to fill out a survey.
Yes.
So that's but you know, it's very hard to get anybody to you know, even really consider that, but I think they will. I think it's moving, and I think, you know, like what Donna was saying about Korea, that's also becoming true in the US, and I think it is kind of a collective bargaining issue, and mothers are kind of saying, women are kind of saying, okay, no support, no babies. And I think it's a very complicated negotiation, and I also think it's probably not a bad idea to go to below replacement fertility for a certain amount of time. I don't think there's anything magic about, you know, maintaining our current population levels, given the state of the globe. But we certainly need to be thinking ahead about what a sustainable system for maintaining a stable population of the optimal size would be. And I worry that demographers aren't really thinking ahead, or they are imagining that future. They're more like looking, you know, they're more like doing what I'm doing, like looking at this crummy data that we have and trying to, you know, come up with a good journal article based on it, you know. And I wish there were more support for, you know, like thinking more expansively about demography. I mean, this is especially true in macroeconomics, where I think the whole field of macro is totally insane, because most of it takes the labor force as a given, exogenously given, or if it's endogenous, it's endogenous in a preposterous, you know, way, right? And it is below replacement fertility is going to have huge macroeconomic and fiscal consequences, but none of our models can really examine that, because population isn't really in them in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Whew, okay. Let's open it up. Anybody want to have a follow-on question to that, or a totally different question? I think that was a spot on answer, by the way.
I have a question, or sort of a question. It seems like some states have in lieu of family-friendly policies, they're trying coerced parenthood by limiting abortion or making abortion illegal, and also perhaps limiting birth control accessibility.
Yeah. Handmaid's Tale. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is what we're living through. You know, I have heard people argue that it's kind of, in fact, that it's motivated by concerns about below replacement fertility. I'm not so sure that is actually the motivating force, but it's definitely it definitely enters into the picture, and it may enter into the future, into the picture more in the future. I mean, for instance, Donna was talking about Korea, and I just read an article in online, I can't remember, about a big, really intense anti-feminist backlash in Korea, and a lot of anger being expressed at women for not fulfilling their traditional roles, and politicians emerging who are basically running on not a mandatory, I haven't seen evidence of literally that the Handmaid's Tale in terms of institutionalized coercion, but it's definitely there's definitely a kind of threat of violence and a violent reprisal that's lurking in the background.
I mean, I think if you take a look at some of the pro-natalist policies in China right now, I mean, coming off of kind of anti-natalist policies, and it's interesting because it's a little bit different from some of the policy stuff you're talking about, supporting single mothers or like, kind of child support policies, whereas their policies are very much this kind of respecting the social value of childbearing or traditional virtues of the Chinese nation, and building a new type of marriage type. I mean, their points are very, very interesting. I'm really curious to see how they're going to do with it, because even this idea of fertility as strength as a nation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think Chinese policies are really retrograde, and I don't think they're going to succeed. I think it's sort of.
I think it's Donna's point, right? I mean, it's the Korea point. Like, once you've already lowered those fertility rates, it's very hard to convince somebody to go back when you have a culture that's built up around those low fertility rates, whether it's apartment buildings or urbanization or whatever that is. I think it's hard to go back to, you can give people bonuses or whatever, but having 3 children in a small apartment in the city is tough to do. So,
yeah.
Well, I think student loan burdens also are affecting U.S. fertility.
Yeah, I agree.
And, if you're not paying off your student loans until you're in your 40s, it's delaying marriage, it's delaying fertility, purchasing homes, all of those things that are adulthood, right?
I mean, is there any data out there that would allow us to look at that student loan impact on
Survey of
fertility?
Consumer Finances, the National Survey of College Graduates has student loans.
The Consumer Finance Survey is through the Fed, right?
Yeah, Survey of Consumer Finances is through the Fed.
And it has fertility. It has family history or fertility.
It has not,
fertility.
kids, right?
It has number of kids.
Yeah, and home ownership. It has all this thing about assets and income. So, but I you would have to think that that burden is going to change people's behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's a good angle.
So, not to be conspiratorial, but do you think the USDA's conservative estimates are in part because you don't want people to see the high costs of childbearing, or do you think it's just a response of not wanting to pay for it, or both? Or do you think it's just really methodological that they don't want to incorporate those things?
I think it's just
Ignorance.
methodological. Sorry, what?
Oh, I just said it's ignorance.
No, I think it is. It's methodological conservatism. Like, this is the way we've done these estimates. It's the same thing that comes in with the national accounts. This is the way we've done it before. We have to be consistent.
But also,
so every time
Nancy,
you do it, they make tiny little changes because the risk of departing from precedent is often very, very high. I think that's it. And actually, I know that I've had conversations with Mark Lino when he was at the Department of Agriculture, saying that he'd gotten death threats from fathers' rights groups because they thought the estimates of the cost of children were too high and that it was making them pay higher child support than they wanted to pay. So they've actually gotten put more pushback from the opposite direction, probably, than from this direction. I've always been kind of amused by that. You know?
But I also think that, I mean, I do think that ignorance at the beginning played a part, because I think the way that these statistics were developed were very much, you know, during a time when it was, you know, predominantly men who were developing these methods, and you know, with little, you know, value put on the time that women spend in these.
Yeah, I would call that bias rather than ignorance, but you're right. It's sort of biased ignorance, right? Isn't that right?
Yes.
It's sort of like
I don't mean
bias,
ignorance in a bad, like,
it's a bias. It's not an active bias, like, oh, we want to, you know,
right.
let's make women look bad. It's a bias like, oh, we don't need to ask that question, or we don't need to think about that, or that's not really important. And so,
or even there might be like, well, now we think it's important, but you know, what do we do? Because we already have this statistic developed in this certain way, and if we jimmy it around, it'll confuse people. Yeah.
Good points.
Yeah. Any other burning last question for Nancy? Here's your shot. Take it. All right.
we used our time very effectively.
Nancy, this has been absolutely fantastic.
And this was fun for me. I really enjoyed it. The discussion was really, really good.
Nancy, does Misty have a copy of your paper?
Yeah, but you know, let me send her the revised version.
Yeah, that would be great.
It's slightly different.
I'd like to share with some graduate students.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, Nancy, again for your time. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for participating, and hope everyone has a nice and peaceful December and holiday season.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.